Hey Reddit. I'm Sarah, 35, and this is the story of how I dealt with a guidance counselor who told me I'd never make it to university, and how I got the sweetest, quietest revenge years later. But to understand why it meant so much, you need to know where it all started. Living with my stepfather, James, was like walking through a house of mirrors. Everything looked perfect on the outside, but inside it was all distorted. He adopted me when I was 6, right after marrying my mom, but I think he mostly did it because it looked good on paper. You know those people who collect fancy degrees to hang on their wall but never read the books? That was basically me in his life. Just another shiny credential for his perfect family collection. Mom used to be different. Before James, she was this amazingly vibrant kindergarten teacher who'd come home with paint on her clothes and wild stories about her students' adventures. She'd make these incredible blanket forts with me where we'd read stories for hours. But after James, she became this shadow, always hovering at the edges of rooms, watching his reactions, adjusting her behavior to match his mood, like one of those weather vanes that spins whichever way the wind blows. Our house was this massive Victorian in the good part of town, the kind of place where neighbors compete over who has the best manicured lawn. James insisted on it because, as he loved to remind everyone, appearance matters in our position. He was a social worker for the school board, which is probably the most ironic thing ever considering how emotionally neglectful he was at home. But God, he was good at playing the part in public. He'd give these speeches at school events about supporting troubled youth, while I sat in the audience feeling like I was watching some bizarre parallel universe version of my stepfather. Had this small bedroom at the top of the house, technically the smallest room, but it became my sanctuary. I'd covered one wall entirely with post-it notes of psychology quotes and theories I'd found interesting. There was something about understanding why people behave the way they do that just clicked with me. Maybe it was growing up watching James manipulate everyone around him with the precision of a surgeon. My mom would say I was being dramatic when I pointed out his behavior, but I'd started keeping a journal documenting the patterns, like how he'd accidentally forget to tell me about family events until the last minute, then make a big show of how I was always disorganized when I couldn't make it. School should have been my escape, but that's where things got complicated. I was doing really well on the actual content, when I could focus long enough to complete things, but there was this constant fog in my brain, like trying to tune a radio that kept slipping between stations. I'd sit there understanding everything the teacher was saying, taking detailed notes even, but when it came time to actually finish assignments, it was like hitting a wall. The thoughts were there, but getting them from my brain onto paper felt impossible sometimes. The worst part was I knew I wasn't stupid. I'd read college-level psychology textbooks for fun, could explain complex theories to my friend Katie during lunch breaks, but something was just off. The anxiety didn't help. There's nothing quite like sitting in class knowing you understand everything but feeling your chest tighten every time you try to complete the work. And of course, James had to be involved in the school too. Every teacher knew him. Every administrator smiled and asked how he was doing. "Oh, you're James's daughter," they'd say. And I'd watch their faces change when my grades didn't match what they expected from the daughter of their beloved school board social worker. That's how I ended up in Ms. Reynolds' office for the first time. My guidance counselor and, as I'd soon learn, another one of James's many admirers in the school system. I still remember walking into her office that first time, my hands shaking, as I tried to explain that I needed help, that something wasn't working right with how I was processing things. The way she looked at me over her glasses, this little smile playing at the corners of her mouth like she already knew exactly what my problem was. "Well," she said, shuffling some papers on her desk, "your father is one of our most respected staff members. I'm sure if there were any real issues, he would have noticed them at home." That first meeting with Ms. Reynolds set the tone for the next 4 years. Every time I tried to explain my struggles, she'd somehow twist it back to James. "Your father deals with troubled teens every day," she'd say, arranging her ceramic apple collection on her desk. "He's never mentioned any concerns about you," as if his silence was proof that I was making everything up. The anxiety got worse after that. I'd sit in class with my heart racing, watching the clock tick down, knowing I understood the material but feeling paralyzed when it came to actually completing anything. Katie, my best friend at the time, would try to help. We'd meet in the library during lunch, and she'd walk me through assignments step by step. "You literally just explained this concept better than our teacher did," she'd say, frustrated on my behalf. "I don't get why you can't just write it down." I didn't get it either. Some days were better than others. Mr. Peterson, my English teacher, seemed to understand something was up. He'd let me stay after class sometimes, giving me extra time to finish essays without making a big deal about it. "Your analysis is college level," he told me once. "You just need to find your own way of getting it out of your head." He was the first teacher who made me feel like maybe I wasn't just lazy or stupid. But for every Mr. Peterson, there were 3 other teachers who knew James. They'd pull me aside after class with these concerned looks, telling me how disappointed they were that I wasn't living up to my potential. "Your father does such important work," they'd say. Like his job somehow meant I should be able to magically focus better. The worst was when they'd tell him about my problems at their little staff gatherings. I started having panic attacks. In the bathroom between classes, the fluorescent lights would buzz overhead while I tried to catch my breath, clutching my psychology textbook to my chest like a shield. That book was my escape. I'd spend hours reading about cognitive behavioral therapy and neuroscience, understanding more and more that what I was experiencing probably had a name, a reason, a solution. But every time I tried to bring up the possibility of ADHD or anxiety to Ms. Reynolds, she'd just smile that patronizing smile. "Sarah," she'd say, like she was talking to a kindergartner, "you need to stop making excuses. Do you know how many students would love to have your advantages? A stable home, a father in education." She never finished that sentence, but the implication was clear. I was just ungrateful. Katie started noticing how I'd freeze up whenever we passed Ms. Reynolds in the hallway. "She's such a betch," Katie would whisper, trying to make me laugh. "Did you see her inspirational poster collection? Hang in there with that stupid cat? Like, way to phone it in on the counseling." But even Katie's jokes couldn't shake the weight that settled on my chest every time I had to go to that office. The mandatory meetings became a sort of twisted ritual. Every semester, I'd sit in that chair across from her desk, watching her flip through my file with those perfectly manicured nails, listening to her sigh dramatically before launching into the same speech about applying myself more. She had this way of making everything sound like a personal favor to James. "I'm only telling you this because your father is such a respected colleague." Things came to a head during my junior year. I'd been staying up late every night, trying to catch up on assignments, drinking so much coffee that my hands would shake. I was getting good grades on tests. Great ones, actually. But the incomplete assignments were dragging me down. One morning, after another night of no sleep, I broke down in Ms. Reynolds' office. Through tears, I tried one last time to explain how it felt like my brain was constantly fighting against me. She just handed me a tissue and said, "Well, have you considered that maybe you're just not cut out for advanced classes? There's no shame in taking the regular track. Not everyone can handle the pressure of higher education. Look at your mother. She's perfectly happy teaching kindergarten." I remember staring at her, watching her adjust her live, laugh, love frame on the wall and feeling something inside me just crack. Not because she was right, but because in that moment, I realized she would never actually hear me. She was too busy seeing James's daughter, the disappointment, the girl who made excuses. That crack inside me grew wider during senior year. I started working at this little coffee shop called The Daily Grind after school, partly to avoid going home, partly because I needed something, anything, that was just mine. The smell of coffee, beans, and the hiss of the espresso machine became more familiar than the sound of my own house. At least here, nobody expected me to be James's perfect daughter. Then came that meeting. You know the one, where they sit you down and ask about your future, like they're doing you some huge favor by planning it out for you. I'd been preparing for weeks, reading university programs, researching psychology departments. I had this whole folder of courses I was interested in, statistics about career paths in counseling. I wanted to help people who felt like I did, lost, unheard, struggling with things they couldn't quite explain. I walked into Ms. Reynolds' office, clutching that folder like a lifeline. The ceramic apples watched me from their shelf as I sat down, my hands shaking slightly as I pulled out my research. "I've been looking into psychology programs," I started, trying to keep my voice steady. "I think I could." That's when she scoffed. Not a small sound. A full, theatrical scoff that seemed to echo off her motivational posters. "Oh, Sarah," she said, like I'd just told her I wanted to be a unicorn trainer. "Please do not apply to university. It would be a huge disappointment for you." I felt my chest tighten, but she wasn't done. "You are not university material," she continued, shuffling through my carefully prepared papers without really looking at them. "You may be better suited for community college or even a certificate in administration, something more realistic for someone with your capabilities." The folder slipped from my hands, papers scattering across her desk. She didn't even pause. "I'm saying this for your own good. Someone needs to be honest with you. Your father agrees that you need to be more practical about your future." I don't remember leaving her office. The next clear memory I have is standing in the bathroom, staring at my reflection under those harsh fluorescent lights, tears making mascara tracks down my cheeks. Katie found me there, still clutching one of my university brochures, now wrinkled and wet with tears. That afternoon at work was surreal. I went through the motions, taking orders, making drinks, forcing smiles, while Ms. Reynolds' words played on repeat in my head. Not university material. The phrase followed me like a shadow, coloring everything gray. But something unexpected happened during that shift. One of our regulars, Dr. Martinez, came in for his usual Americano. He was this retired psychology professor who'd been coming in for months, and we'd often talk about different theories while I made his drink. That day, he must have noticed something was off because he asked what was wrong. Before I knew it, I was telling him everything. About my struggles with focusing, about Ms. Reynolds, about my dreams of studying psychology. I expected him to agree with her, to tell me I was reaching too high. Instead, he looked thoughtful. You know, he said, stirring his coffee slowly. You just explained cognitive dissonance better than some of my graduate students used to. And you learned that from reading on your own? When I nodded, he continued, sometimes the people who struggle the most with traditional education are the ones who have the most to offer the field. They see things differently, understand pain and resilience in a way others can't. I clung to his words like a life raft, but the doubt had already taken root. That night, I put my university brochures in a box under my bed. I told myself I was just being realistic. Practical. After all, who was I to think I could handle university when I could barely handle high school? Maybe Ms. Reynolds was right. Maybe I needed to accept my limitations. The rest of senior year passed in a blur of coffee orders and half-finished assignments. I stopped raising my hand in class, stopped sharing psychology facts with Katie at lunch. What was the point? Every time I started to feel interested in something, Ms. Reynolds' voice would echo in my head. Not university material. After graduation, life became this weird blur of different jobs and quiet disappointments. I kept working at the daily grind for a while, but eventually the sight of students coming in with their textbooks and university hoodies became too much. So I switched to a bookstore, then to an insurance office doing filing, then to a dental clinic as a receptionist. Nothing ever felt right. The funny thing about working as a receptionist was how many people would tell me their life stories while waiting for their appointments. They'd lean against my desk, nervous about their root canals, and suddenly start opening up about their divorces or their troubled teenagers, or their anxiety attacks. I'd find myself automatically applying everything I'd learned from my psychology. Books, asking the right questions, helping them feel heard. My boss even commented on how calm patients were after talking to me, but every time someone said, "You should be a therapist," I'd feel that old, familiar tightness in my chest. Ms. Reynolds' voice would creep back in, not university material. So I'd just smile and file another insurance claim, trying to ignore the ache of what could have been. Home wasn't any better. James had gotten a promotion at the school board, which meant even more dinner parties where I had to play the role of the grateful daughter. He'd introduce me to his colleagues with this particular tone. Sarah's finding her way in the administrative field, like it was some noble choice I'd made, rather than the path I'd been pushed down. Mom had stopped asking about my future altogether. I think it was easier for her to pretend I was content than to acknowledge the growing sadness she saw in my eyes. Sometimes I'd catch her watching me when I was reading my psychology books during lunch breaks at home, but she never said anything. She just kept rearranging the perfect family photos on our walls. Depression crept in slowly, like a fog, rolling in. First, I stopped reading my psychology books. What was the point? Then I started calling in sick to work more often, spending days in bed staring at the ceiling. Katie would try to get me to go out, but I'd make excuses. How could I face her? When she was finishing her degree while I was just existing, Dr. Martinez still came to the bookstore where I'd started working. He'd find me in the psychology section during my breaks, usually reshelving books I'd been reading when no one was looking. Still interested in cognitive behavioral therapy? He'd ask, pretending not to notice how I'd quickly put the books back. He never pushed, never lectured. He'd just leave academic journals on my counter with certain articles marked, like little breadcrumbs leading back to myself. One particularly bad day, I was organizing the self-help section when I found myself staring at a book about adult ADHD. Everything in it sounded so familiar. The struggles with focus, the paralysis when facing tasks, the feeling of being constantly overwhelmed. I bought it with my employee discount and read it cover to cover that night, crying as years of self-doubt suddenly made sense. The next morning, I called in sick again. But instead of staying in bed, I drove to a clinic I'd found online. The psychiatrist listened to my story, really listened, and ran some tests. 2 hours later, I had a diagnosis: ADHD and anxiety. She looked at me over her notepad and said something that shook my world. You know, many people with ADHD struggle in traditional school settings but excel in university, where they can focus on subjects they're passionate about. I sat in my car afterward, holding the prescription and diagnosis papers, feeling like I was standing on the edge of something huge. For the first time in years, Ms. Reynolds' voice in my head seemed a little quieter. That night, I pulled out my old box of university brochures from under my bed. They were wrinkled and coffee-stained now, but the programs were still running, still there, still possible. The first person I told about my diagnosis was Dr. Martinez. He was browsing the philosophy section when I practically ambushed him with my paperwork, hands shaking with nervous energy. He looked at the papers, then at me, and smiled. "So, what's your next move?" Not, "I told you so." Not, This explains everything. Just what's next? It was the first time anyone had asked me that, without already having an answer in mind. I'd love to say I marched straight to a university and signed up, but reality was messier. First came the medication journey, finding the right dose, adjusting to the side effects, learning how my brain worked with this new chemical balance. Some days were amazing. Suddenly, I could sit down and actually finish things. Other days felt like I was learning to walk all over again. Then I met Mark at the bookstore. He was getting his master's in education, buying some required reading for his thesis. We got talking about psychology and education. Okay, I might have gone on a bit of a rant about the failings of high school counseling systems, and somehow that turned into coffee, which turned into dinner, which turned into him helping me study for university entrance exams. You know more about this stuff than I do, he'd say when we'd review psychology concepts. You just need to prove it to them on paper. He didn't know about Ms. Reynolds, about the not university material thing. I hadn't told him yet, but somehow he knew exactly what to say when the doubt would creep in. The application process was terrifying. Every essay question felt like a trap, every form like a judgment. I must have rewritten my personal statement 20 times. Mark found me at 3 a.m. once, surrounded by crumpled drafts, having a full-blown panic attack. What if she was right? I kept saying. What if I'm not? He just picked up one of the drafts and started reading it aloud. My analysis of how early educational experiences shape adult self-perception, backed by research I'd done independently. Does this sound like someone who's not university material? He asked. I submitted my applications in secret. Didn't tell my family, didn't tell Katie, didn't even let myself hope too much. But I had a whole support system I hadn't even realized I'd built. Dr. Martinez wrote me a recommendation letter. My psychiatrist provided documentation for academic accommodations. Mark helped me navigate the financial aid forms. Even my boss, at the bookstore, adjusted my schedule so I could make all the admissions interviews. The first acceptance letter came on a Tuesday. I was at work when the email notification popped up on my phone. My hands were shaking so bad I had to ask a customer to hold my scanner. Not only accepted, but they were impressed by my unique perspective on educational psychology and cognitive development. They wanted me in their program. I printed the acceptance letter at work and drove straight to the Daily Grind, taped it right next to where Ms. Reynolds' desk used to be in my mind. Then I cried into my coffee while the barista, who had no idea what was happening, awkwardly offered me extra whipped cream. That night, I finally told Mark everything. About Ms. Reynolds, about James, about all the years of believing I wasn't enough. He listened, really listened, then said something I'll never forget. They were wrong about you, but more importantly, you were brave enough to prove it. Telling. My family was interesting. I waited until I had 3 acceptance letters, just to be sure. James did his typical thing, made it about himself somehow, talked about how his connections in education must have helped. Mom seemed genuinely happy, but kept looking at James like she was waiting for his approval. I didn't care. For the first time in my life, I didn't need their validation. The real moment of truth came during orientation week. Standing on campus, student ID in hand, textbooks in my bag, books I was actually supposed to read this time. My assigned academic advisor turned out to be this amazing professor who specialized in educational psychology and neurodivergence in academic settings. When I told her about my ADHD, she didn't just understand. She had actual strategies to help me succeed. That first semester hit me like a tidal wave. Suddenly, I was drowning in readings, papers, group projects, everything I'd struggled with in high school, but now at a university level. The difference? This time I had support, strategies, and medication. And something else. Pure burning determination to prove Ms. Reynolds wrong. My advisor, Dr. Chen, was basically the anti-Reynolds. First thing she did was help me set up a study system that worked with my ADHD brain instead of against it. Traditional note-taking doesn't work for everyone, she said, showing me how to create mind maps and visual study guides. Your brain processes information differently. That's not a weakness, it's just a different path to the same destination. The academic accommodations were life-changing. Extra time on exams meant I could actually show what I knew without my anxiety taking over. Permission to record lectures meant I could focus on understanding instead of frantically trying to write everything down. For the first time in my life, I wasn't fighting my brain while trying to learn. My first A+ came in developmental psychology. I stared at the grade for 10 minutes straight, then called Mark crying. He took me out to celebrate, and I kept the paper with my professor's comments. Exceptional analysis. Your personal insights add depth to the theoretical framework. I still have that paper somewhere, but it wasn't all smooth sailing. Some professors were old school, didn't really believe in ADHD. One guy, Dr. Thompson, actually said in class that these modern diagnoses are just excuses for laziness. I felt that old shame creeping back in until I realized something. I understood the material better than half the class. My essays were getting published in student journals. My questions were starting class discussions that ran over time. I joined a study group that turned into a second family. Lisa, Tom, and Mai. All psychology majors with their own stories of being underestimated. We'd camp out in the library until closing, surrounded by empty coffee cups and psychology textbooks. They never made me feel weird about my accommodations or my need to pace while studying. Instead, they'd just move the furniture to give me a walking path. By second year, I was on the dean's list. I printed out a copy of my transcript and thought about sending it to Ms. Reynolds, but that felt small somehow. This wasn't about her anymore. This was about me discovering who I could be when someone actually believed in me. I started volunteering at the university's peer counseling center. That's where I met Ashley, a freshman who reminded me so much of myself. She had the same look I used to have, smart but scattered, drowning in potential and anxiety. Her high school counselor had told her to consider something less challenging than psychology. I don't know if I can do this. She told me one day, fighting back tears after a rough exam. I showed her my first-year papers, complete with coffee stains and ADHD notation systems. Told her about Ms. Reynolds, about the not university material comment. Her eyes got wide. But you're like the best peer counselor here. That's when it hit me. I wasn't just proving Ms. Reynolds wrong anymore. I was becoming the person I needed when I was younger. Every time I helped another student work through their anxiety, every time I shared my ADHD strategies with someone who was struggling, I was healing that scared kid who sat in Ms. Reynolds' office believing she wasn't good enough. Senior year, they asked me to be a teaching assistant for the Introduction to Psychology course. Standing at the front of the lecture hall, explaining concepts I once read about secretly in the bookstore, felt like some kind of cosmic full circle. Students would come to my office hours, and I'd see that same spark I had. That desperate love of psychology mixed with fear of not being good enough. I graduated with honors. Walking across that stage, hearing my name called with summa cum laude attached to it, I thought about sending Ms. Reynolds an invitation, but something stopped me. Maybe because deep down, I knew this achievement wasn't about her. It wasn't even about proving her wrong anymore. It was about proving myself right. Besides, I was already thinking about what came next. A master's program in behavioral psychology had caught my eye. Something about the intersection of educational psychology and neurodivergence. Dr. Chen thought I'd be perfect for it. You have the academic skills, she said. But more importantly, you have the lived experience. You understand what these students are going through. The master's program was intense, but in the best way possible. My thesis focused on the impact of early educational support on academic outcomes for neurodivergent students. Every interview I conducted, every paper I read, every statistic I analyzed felt personal. I wasn't just studying the subject. I was excavating my own past, turning pain into purpose. Mark was incredible through it all. He'd bring me coffee during late-night writing sessions, listen to me practice my presentations, and never once complained when our apartment turned into a paper jungle during finals. You're going to change lives, he'd say, watching me highlight yet another research paper at 3 a.m. You already are. I defended my thesis to a packed room. Dr. Martinez came. He'd retired from teaching, but still showed up with a fresh Americano for me. Dr. Chen was there too, beaming like a proud parent. Even Katie drove in from out of state. The only people missing were my parents. But I'd stopped expecting them at my academic achievements. James always had some board meeting, and Mom, well, you know. The defense went perfectly. My research on the long-term effects of dismissive educational counseling hit home with the committee. One professor actually teared up during my presentation of student testimonials. This isn't just research, she said during the Q&A. This is a wake-up call for our entire educational support system. I graduated with distinction. Again, the ceremony was beautiful, but the real moment came after, when I got my first job offer. A private practice specializing in academic anxiety and ADHD was looking for someone with both clinical knowledge and personal experience. During the interview, I told them about my journey, the struggles, the diagnosis, the transformation. They offered me the position on the spot. My first office was nothing like Ms. Reynolds. No ceramic apples, no generic motivational posters. Instead, I had fidget toys on every surface, fairy lights for students who hated fluorescent lighting, and a small couch perfect for anxious teenagers to curl up on. Most importantly, I had a wall of success stories, notes and cards from students who'd found their path despite being told they couldn't. That's when things got complicated. James got sick. Aggressive cancer, the kind that doesn't mess around. Suddenly, I was splitting my time between my practice and the hospital, watching this man who'd shaped so much of my life through his absence slowly fade away. It was confusing. All these unresolved feelings bubbling up during hospital visits. Mom was lost. She'd spent so many years orbiting around him that she didn't know how to be on her own. I'd find her organizing his social worker awards at 3 a.m., like keeping his achievements in order could somehow keep him here. One night, after a particularly rough chemo session, James actually apologized to me. I think I missed something important, he said, looking at my business cards on his bedside table. You became something remarkable despite me. Not because of me. I didn't know what to say to that. 20 years of therapy techniques and I had no words. Because he was right. I had done this despite him. Despite Ms. Reynolds. Despite every voice that said I couldn't. But I also didn't want his deathbed revelation. It felt too late. Too convenient. He died on a Tuesday. The funeral was scheduled for Saturday. A big affair. Because of course it was. James had touched many lives professionally. Even if he'd missed the ones closest to him. The school board was sending representatives. Former colleagues would speak about his dedication to troubled youth. The irony was thick enough to choke on. I agreed to help Mom with the arrangements, going through his papers, helping her pick out photos for the memorial display. That's when I found it, my old high school file, complete with Ms. Reynolds' notes. Pages of her elegant handwriting dismissing my struggles, referencing her close professional relationship with James as proof that I was just making excuses. Reading it now, with my master's degree and thriving practice, should have felt vindicating. Instead, it just made me sad for that scared teenager who'd believed every word. Mom asked me to say a few words at the visitation. I was working on something appropriately diplomatic when she mentioned the guest list. Oh, and Susan Reynolds RSVP'd, she said casually, like she hadn't just dropped a bomb in my lap. She was always so fond of you. I spent the morning of the visitation in my office, going through files of students I'd helped over the past year, kids who'd been told they weren't smart enough, weren't focused enough, weren't material for whatever dream they were chasing. Every success story felt like a tiny rebellion against what Ms. Reynolds had tried to do to me. The funeral home was exactly what James would have wanted. Tastefully expensive, full of important people talking about important things. Mom had done an amazing job with the photos, creating this perfect timeline of his professional achievements. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was Father of the Year. I was standing near his social worker awards when I felt someone approach. Before I even turned around, I knew it was her. Maybe it was the slight scent of that perfume she always wore, or maybe just that same heavy feeling I used to get in her office. Sarah? Her voice hadn't changed, still that same careful blend of authority and false warmth. Oh, Sarah, I'm so sorry about your father. I turned around slowly. She looked older, of course, but otherwise exactly the same. Still wearing those reading glasses on a chain, still with that perfect professional smile. She reached out like she was going to hug me, already launching into some speech about how proud James had been of my administrative career. That's when I did it. I looked at her with the blankest expression I could manage and said, "I'm sorry. You must be confusing me with someone else." The shock on her face was perfect. "I was your guidance counselor," she said, like she was reminding me of some wonderful shared history. "For 4 years in high school." I just shook my head, keeping my face carefully confused. "Sorry, I honestly don't remember you." She started to sputter about specific meetings, about James, about how close she'd been to our family. Each denial from me seemed to deflate her a little more. I watched her trying to process how someone she'd tried so hard to make small could now so easily make her feel invisible. Here's the thing about revenge. Sometimes the quietest kind hits the hardest. I could have told her about my degrees, my practice, all the lives I've helped change. I could have shown her the research I've published on the damage done by dismissive educational counseling. I could have made her face exactly how wrong she'd been about me, but making her a footnote in my story, acting like she'd been so insignificant that I couldn't even remember her, that felt better than any confrontation ever could. I excused myself politely, leaving her standing there beside James's photo display. As I walked away, I heard her trying to explain to another guest how she'd been such an important part of my high school years. Nobody was really listening. Later that night, after all the guests had gone and Mom was finally sleeping, I went to my office. I had a session scheduled early the next morning with a teenager whose teacher had told her she wasn't cut out for advanced math. I pulled out a fresh notebook. I always start with a new one for each client, and wrote at the top, "You are exactly where you're supposed to be." My degrees hang on the wall now, right where my clients can see them. Sometimes, when I'm helping a student work through their self-doubt, I'll catch a glimpse of those frames and remember that scared girl in Ms. Reynolds' office. She's not gone. She's part of why I can really hear what these kids are saying, why I know exactly how much damage a single dismissive adult can do, and how much healing the right support can bring. I never sent Ms. Reynolds my transcripts, never wrote her a letter about how wrong she was, never tried to make her understand the impact she'd had. Because in the end, this story isn't about her. It's about every student who's been told they're not enough, every dreamer who's been advised to dream smaller, every person who's had to become their own champion when the people who should have supported them failed. My last client today was a young girl with ADHD, bright and scattered and full of potential. She asked me if I thought she could make it in college, her eyes full of that familiar mix of hope and fear. I showed her my wall of success stories, pointed out all the different paths represented there. "You know," I told her, "someone once told me I wasn't university material." She looked shocked. "What did you do?" I smiled. thinking of Ms. Reynolds's face at the funeral, of all the lives I've touched since then, of how satisfying it felt to turn her into nothing more than a forgettable moment in my story. I proved them wrong, I said. And then I made sure no one else would have to.